The year is 445 CE. Across the vast steppes of Central Europe, a single name strikes terror into the hearts of emperors and common folk alike. That name is Attila the Hun. Known to his enemies as the Scourge of God, this nomadic warlord would forge one of history's most feared empires, extract tribute from the mighty Romans, and come within striking distance of conquering the known world. But how did a barbarian from the windswept plains become the most powerful man in Europe? And what dark secrets lay behind his meteoric rise to absolute power? This is not just another tale of ancient conquest. This is the story of a man who turned diplomacy into extortion, warfare into art, and fear itself into his greatest weapon. A ruler so cunning that he could make emperors kneel while speaking their own language. So ruthless that entire cities would surrender at the mere mention of his approach. Yet beneath the legend of the savage barbarian lies a far more complex and fascinating truth. To understand Attila, we must first understand the world he was born to conquer. The Huns were not always the terror of Europe. They emerged from the shadows of history around 370 CE, a mysterious nomadic people who swept westward from beyond the Volga River like a human tsunami. These weren't just raiders or wandering tribes. They were a military revolution on horseback, wielding recurved bows that could pierce Roman armor from distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. Picture this. You're a Roman soldier stationed along the Danube frontier. You've heard whispers of strange horsemen from the east, but nothing could prepare you for your first encounter with Hunnic cavalry. They appear on the horizon like a dust storm. But this storm carries death. Their arrows rain down with devastating accuracy, while they remain tantalizingly out of reach. By the time you've drawn your sword, they've already wheeled away, leaving only corpses and the thunder of hoofbeats in their wake. The arrival of the Huns triggered what historians call the Great Migration, though it was more like a continental game of violent musical chairs. Germanic tribes who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves fleeing westward, crashing into Roman territory not as conquerors, but as refugees. The delicate balance that had kept the barbarian tribes in check for centuries was shattered in a matter of decades. Into this chaos was born Attila, around 406 CE, in the heart of Pannonia, present-day Hungary. But this was no ordinary barbarian child destined for a life of simple raiding. Attila was born into royalty, the nephew of the Hunnic kings Oktar and Ruga. His education was unlike anything you might imagine for a so-called savage. Yes, he learned to shoot a bow from horseback and wield a sword with deadly precision. But he also learned something far more dangerous: languages. Attila didn't just speak Hunnic. He mastered Gothic and Latin, the diplomatic languages of his age. Imagine the shock of Roman ambassadors expecting to negotiate with a barbaric chieftain through interpreters, only to find themselves face to face with a man who could debate them in their own tongue, quote their own laws back at them, and expose their weaknesses with surgical precision. This linguistic prowess wasn't just impressive. It was a weapon that would prove more devastating than any sword. The young prince's education extended far beyond languages and warfare. He studied the Romans themselves, learning their politics, their fears, their internal divisions. He understood that the mighty empire that had once conquered the known world was now split in two. The western and eastern halves often more concerned with fighting each other than any external threat. This knowledge would become the foundation of his future dominance. When King Ruga died in 434 CE, power passed to his nephews, Attila and his older brother Bleda. The Romans, perhaps hoping to deal with divided leadership, found themselves facing something far worse than a single tyrant. The brothers complemented each other perfectly. Bleda provided legitimacy and experience, while Attila brought innovation and ruthless ambition. Together, they immediately set about renegotiating the relationship between the Huns and the Roman Empire. The Treaty of Margus, signed in 434 CE, was a masterpiece of diplomatic extortion. The Romans, accustomed to paying modest subsidies to keep barbarian tribes quiet, suddenly found themselves facing demands that would make a modern mafia boss blush. 700 pounds of gold annually, plus the immediate return of any Hunnic deserters. To put this in perspective, 700 pounds of gold was enough to pay the salaries of an entire Roman legion for months. But here's where Attila's true genius revealed itself. He didn't just demand tribute. He created a system of perpetual extortion. Every missed payment, every delayed negotiation, every Roman attempt to play clever politics became a pretext for invasion. And each invasion resulted in new, more humiliating terms. It was a protection racket on a continental scale. The brothers' joint rule, however, contained the seeds of its own destruction. 2 kings meant divided loyalty, split decisions, and the constant potential for civil war. Attila, the younger brother, watched and waited. He studied not just Roman weakness, but the limitations of shared power. In 445 CE, his patience ran out. Bleda's death remains one of history's most convenient mysteries. The official story spoke of hunting accidents and natural causes, but no one who knew Attila believed it for a moment. In a single stroke, the younger brother had eliminated the only person who stood between him and absolute power over the most feared military force in Europe. The student had become the master, and the master was about to become a legend. Now sole ruler of the Hunnic Confederation, Attila immediately set about consolidating his power and expanding his ambitions. The modest tribute demands of the past became extravagant ransoms for peace. When Emperor Theodosius II of the Eastern Roman Empire hesitated to meet these new demands, Attila provided a demonstration of what hesitation would cost. The invasion of 441 CE was not just a military campaign. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Attila's forces didn't simply attack Roman cities, they obliterated them. Margus, Viminaxium, Singidunum, and Sirmium fell in quick succession, each destruction more complete than the last. But the real genius lay not in the destruction itself, but in how news of that destruction spread. Attila understood something that many conquerors missed. Reputation could be more powerful than any army. Each city that fell without a fight because its defenders had heard what happened to those who resisted was a victory won without losing a single Hun. Terror became his advance guard, preparing the way for conquest more effectively than any siege engine. The psychological impact of these campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military objectives. Roman citizens, who had grown up believing their empire was eternal and invincible, suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that their world might end. Not through gradual decline or political transformation, but through violent, total destruction at the hands of a barbarian king who seemed to appear and disappear like a force of nature. Emperor Theodosius II, a scholarly man more comfortable with theological debates than military crises, found himself completely outmatched. His advisors, trained in the subtle arts of Roman diplomacy, were unprepared for an opponent who treated negotiation as merely another form of warfare. When they sent ambassadors to discuss terms, Attila received them on horseback, forcing these dignified Romans to crane their necks upward to address him, a deliberate humiliation that established the power dynamic from the first moment. The Treaty of Anatolius in 443 CE was a document that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The annual tribute tripled to 2,100 pounds of gold, with an immediate penalty payment of 6,000 pounds. To put this in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the Eastern Roman Empire was estimated at around 270,000 pounds of gold. Attila was demanding nearly 10% of the empire's total income as the price for not destroying it completely. But money was never Attila's ultimate goal. Gold was simply a tool, a means of demonstrating Roman weakness while strengthening his own position. Every pound of tribute was proof to his followers that their king could make the mighty Romans kneel. Every humiliating treaty was evidence that the empire that had once conquered the world was now reduced to buying temporary peace from a barbarian. The Hunnic military machine that enforced these demands was unlike anything Europe had seen before. At its core were the Hunnic heavy cavalry, mounted archers whose recurved bows could penetrate armor at ranges that left their enemies helpless. These weren't the crude weapons of primitive nomads, but sophisticated instruments of war. laminated from horn, wood, and sinew to achieve maximum power and accuracy. But Attila's forces were more than just Hunnic cavalry. By the height of his power, his army was a multinational confederation that would have impressed a modern NATO commander. Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, Rugians, Syrians, and dozens of other tribes marched under his banner. Some served willingly, drawn by the promise of plunder and glory. Others were compelled by fear or political necessity. All were bound together by Attila's personal charisma and his proven ability to deliver victory after victory. The logistics of managing such a diverse force were staggering. Different tribes had different fighting styles, different weapons, different concepts of honor and loyalty. Attila had to be part general, part diplomat, part anthropologist, constantly balancing the competing interests and egos of his coalition while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective military action. This wasn't just about commanding respect through fear, though Attila certainly mastered that art. He also understood the importance of shared success. When the Huns won, everyone won. Plunder was distributed according to contribution and status, but no tribe went home empty-handed. Victory celebrations became opportunities for political theater, with Attila publicly honoring his allies while subtly reinforcing his own supreme authority. The intelligence network that supported these military operations was equally sophisticated. Attila's agents operated throughout Roman territory, gathering information about troop movements, political developments, and economic conditions. He often knew about Roman military preparations before some Roman generals did, allowing him to strike where and when his enemies least expected it. This intelligence advantage was multiplied by Attila's linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge. When Roman ambassadors arrived at his court, they often found themselves debating not just with a barbarian king, but with someone who understood their political system better than they did. He could quote Roman law, reference historical precedents, and exploit contradictions in imperial policy with devastating effectiveness. The famous account of the Byzantine diplomat Priscus, who visited Attila's court in 449 CE, provides a fascinating glimpse into this complex political theater. Priscus expected to find a crude barbarian stronghold, but instead encountered what was essentially a mobile capital city, complete with diplomatic protocols, legal procedures, and administrative structures that rivaled those of Constantinople itself. Attila's personal presence was as carefully calculated as his military strategies. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically unimpressive, of medium height with a broad chest, large head, and small eyes. But his bearing and demeanor projected absolute authority. He walked with what sources called a haughty gait, and his penetrating stare was said to make even experienced diplomats uncomfortable. This image was no accident. Attila understood that leadership was as much about performance as substance. His court ceremonies were elaborate displays of power designed to impress visitors and reinforce his authority over his diverse subjects. He would receive ambassadors while seated on a throne, surrounded by his most trusted advisors and fiercest warriors, creating an atmosphere of barely contained violence that made peaceful negotiation seem like a generous alternative to annihilation. The culmination of Attila's eastern campaigns came in 447 CE, with perhaps his most devastating invasion of the Balkans. This wasn't just another raid for tribute. It was a systematic campaign of destruction that brought his forces to within sight of Constantinople itself. The psychological impact on the Eastern Roman Empire was catastrophic. Citizens who had lived their entire lives believing the capital was impregnable suddenly found themselves staring at Hunnic campfires on the horizon. Emperor Theodosius II, faced with the imminent destruction of his capital, was forced to accept terms that were less a treaty than a surrender document. The annual tribute was increased yet again, and the Romans were forced to establish a buffer zone south of the Danube River that they were forbidden to fortify or garrison. Essentially, Attila had forced the Eastern Roman Empire to partially disarm itself as the price of survival. But perhaps the most humiliating aspect of these negotiations was their location and format. Attila refused to meet Roman ambassadors in any building, insisting that all negotiations take place in the open air with him mounted on horseback. This wasn't just barbarian custom. It was a calculated insult that forced the representatives of the world's most powerful empire to literally look up to their conqueror. The success of these eastern campaigns established Attila as the dominant power in European politics, but it also created new challenges. Victory had brought wealth and prestige, but it had also raised expectations among his followers. The various tribes and nations under his command had grown accustomed to regular campaigns and the plunder they provided. Peace, even profitable peace, risked internal dissatisfaction and potential rebellion. Moreover, Attila's very success had begun to alarm potential allies and enemies alike. The Western Roman Empire, while weaker than its eastern counterpart, possessed resources and military capabilities that could pose a serious threat if properly organized. The Visigothic kingdom in Gaul represented another major power that might resist Hunnic expansion. Even some of Attila's own allies began to wonder if their king's ambitions might eventually threaten their own independence. The political landscape of 450 CE was thus a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came from the most unexpected source imaginable: a marriage proposal from the sister of the Western Roman Emperor. Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, was a woman trapped by the political constraints of her time and status. By 450 CE, Attila's empire had reached its zenith, stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea, commanding tribute from both Roman empires and striking fear into the hearts of every European ruler. But at the height of his power, a single letter would change everything and set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The letter came from Honoria, sister of Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, and it was perhaps the most audacious correspondence in ancient history. Trapped in an unwanted betrothal to a Roman senator, Honoria secretly dispatched her engagement ring to Attila, along with a desperate plea for rescue. What she intended as a cry for help, Attila interpreted as a marriage proposal and a legitimate claim to half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. This wasn't merely an opportunity for Attila, it was the ultimate prize. Marriage to a Roman princess would legitimize his rule in Roman eyes, provide him with a legal claim to Western territories, and potentially unite the barbarian and Roman worlds under his dominion. The prospect was intoxicating, and Attila immediately began planning what would become his most ambitious campaign yet. Emperor Valentinian III was horrified when he learned of his sister's reckless correspondence. He categorically refused Attila's demands, insisting that Honoria had no authority to make such proposals and that she was already promised to another. But Attila was not a man to be denied. He had built his reputation on the principle that what he wanted, he took, and he had never wanted anything more than this ultimate validation of his power. The Honoria affair provided Attila with the perfect pretext for his long-planned invasion of the Western Roman Empire. In 451 CE, he assembled the largest army of his career, a multinational force that historians estimate numbered between 300,000 and 700,000 warriors. This wasn't just a Hunnic army, it was a coalition of nations united under Attila's banner, including Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Syrians, and dozens of other tribes, each contributing their finest warriors to what they believed would be the final conquest of Rome. Attila's strategy was characteristically brilliant. Rather than attacking Italy directly, which would force him to cross the heavily defended Alpine passes, he chose to invade Gaul, striking at the wealthy cities of the Rhine and threatening to cut off Roman Britain from the continent. His target was Aurelianum, modern-day Orléans, a prosperous trading center whose capture would open the road to the heart of Gaul. The siege of Aurelianum revealed both Attila's military evolution and his growing impatience. The Huns, traditionally mobile cavalry warriors, had adapted their tactics to include sophisticated siege warfare. They constructed massive earthworks, deployed siege engines, and systematically isolated the city. But Aurelianum's walls proved stronger than expected, and as the siege dragged on, Attila faced a problem he had rarely encountered: organized Roman resistance. Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman general, had been preparing for this moment his entire career. Known as the last of the Romans, Aetius possessed intimate knowledge of Hunnic tactics, having spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns and even employing Hunnic mercenaries in previous campaigns. He understood that defeating Attila required more than Roman legions. It demanded a coalition as diverse as Attila's own. In a diplomatic masterstroke that matched Attila's own political cunning, Aetius forged an alliance with the Visigoths under King Theodoric III. This was an extraordinary achievement, uniting two peoples who had been enemies for generations against the common Hunnic threat. The alliance expanded to include Franks, Burgundians, Alans, and other Germanic tribes, creating a truly pan-European coalition against Attila's advance. The armies met on the Catalaunian plains near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne, in what became one of the most significant battles in European history. The scale was unprecedented. Contemporary sources describe a battlefield so vast that the armies took hours to deploy, with hundreds of thousands of warriors stretching across miles of terrain. This wasn't just a battle. It was a collision of civilizations, East against West, nomad against settler, barbarian against Roman. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical complexity. Attila, recognizing the strength of the Roman Visigothic center, attempted to seize the high ground on the right flank, hoping to use his superior cavalry to envelope the enemy. But Aetius had anticipated this move, positioning his most reliable troops to contest every hill and valley. The fighting was savage and prolonged, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. As the sun began to set, disaster struck both armies. King Theodoric I was killed in the melee, sending shockwaves through the Visigothic ranks. But Attila's forces had suffered equally heavy casualties, and for the first time in his career, the great conqueror found himself unable to achieve a clear victory. As darkness fell, both armies withdrew to defensive positions, neither side certain of the outcome. The aftermath of the Catalaunian plains marked a crucial turning point in Attila's career. While he had not been decisively defeated, he had been stopped, and for a leader whose power rested on an aura of invincibility, even a stalemate was a form of defeat. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Attila's enemies had proven they could stand against him and survive. But Attila was far from finished. If he could not claim his bride through conquest of Gaul, he would take her by striking at the heart of the Western Empire itself. In 452 CE, he launched his invasion of Italy, crossing the Alps with a smaller but still formidable army, driven now by personal fury as much as political ambition. The Italian campaign began with characteristic Hunnic efficiency and brutality. Aquileia, one of the wealthiest cities in northern Italy, became the first target. The siege was a demonstration of Attila's rage and his army's devastating capabilities. When the city finally fell, Attila ordered its complete destruction. Contemporary accounts describe Aquileia being so thoroughly demolished that travelers could barely identify where it had once stood. The message was clear. This was the fate awaiting anyone who defied the Hun. City after city fell as Attila's army swept through the Po Valley. Milan, with its magnificent churches and palaces, was sacked and burned. Padua suffered a similar fate. The great trading centers that had made northern Italy prosperous were systematically destroyed, their wealth carried off to fill Attila's war chests. Refugees fled southward, carrying tales of destruction that grew more horrific with each telling. As Attila's army approached the outskirts of Rome itself, panic gripped the Eternal City. The walls that had protected Rome for centuries suddenly seemed inadequate against the man who had brought the mighty empires of Constantinople to their knees. Emperor Valentinian III, the same ruler who had refused to honor his sister's marriage proposal, now faced the prospect of seeing his capital reduced to ashes. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that one of history's most dramatic encounters took place. Pope Leo I, later canonized as Saint Leo the Great, requested a meeting with Attila. The Pope, accompanied by a small delegation of Roman officials, traveled north to meet the conqueror near Mantua. What transpired in that meeting has been debated by historians for 15 centuries. Legend claims that Pope Leo's spiritual authority so impressed Attila that the barbarian king was moved to spare Rome. Some accounts suggest that Leo was accompanied by the apparitions of Saints Peter and Paul, threatening divine retribution if Attila proceeded. But the reality was likely more complex and practical. Attila was a shrewd politician who understood the power of symbols and the value of mercy when strategically applied. Several factors likely influenced Attila's decision to withdraw from Italy. His army, while still formidable, was suffering from disease, possibly plague, which was decimating his ranks far more effectively than Roman resistance. Supply lines stretched back to Pannonia were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Most critically, news had reached him that Eastern Roman forces were launching attacks on his homeland, threatening the very heart of his empire while he pursued personal ambitions in Italy. There was also the matter of gold. The Romans, as they had so many times before, offered substantial payments in exchange for withdrawal. Attila, ever the pragmatist, recognized that a live empire that could pay tribute was more valuable than a destroyed city that could offer only ruins. The meeting with Pope Leo provided him with a face-saving way to accept Roman gold, while appearing magnanimous rather than merely mercenary. The withdrawal from Italy marked the end of Attila's active campaigning, though few recognized it at the time. He returned to his court in Pannonia, his marriage to Honoria still unconsummated, his claim to Roman territories still unrecognized, but he had extracted another massive tribute from the Western Empire, and reinforced his reputation as a leader who could be negotiated with as well as feared. Back in his palace, Attila began planning what he claimed would be his final campaign against Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had taken advantage of his absence to fortify their defenses and reduce their tribute payments. Attila spoke of a great expedition that would finally bring the eastern capital under his direct control, ending decades of diplomatic games and establishing his rule over the entire Roman world. But fate had other plans. In early 453 CE, Attila took a new wife, a young Gothic woman named Ildiko. The wedding was celebrated with typical Hunnic excess, featuring days of feasting, drinking, and ceremonial gift-giving. It was to be a joyous occasion, marking what many hoped would be a new chapter in Attila's reign, perhaps one focused on consolidation rather than conquest. The morning after his wedding night, servants found Attila dead in his marriage chamber. The official account, recorded by the historian Priscus, stated that the great conqueror had suffered a severe nosebleed during the night and choked on his own blood, possibly exacerbated by heavy drinking during the wedding festivities. His young bride was found cowering in terror, apparently unharmed, but traumatized by the horrific scene. The timing of Attila's death immediately sparked rumors and conspiracy theories. Some whispered that Ildiko had been an assassin, sent by Roman agents to eliminate their greatest enemy. Others suggested that his own generals, tired of constant warfare and fearful of his increasingly erratic behavior, had arranged his murder. The fact that he died on his wedding night, after decades of surviving battles and assassination attempts, seemed too convenient to be natural, but the most likely explanation remains the official one. Attila was in his late 40s, an advanced age for a warrior of his era. Years of campaigning, stress, heavy drinking, and the physical demands of leadership had taken their toll. The massive feast and celebration of his wedding, combined with his known tendency toward excess, could easily have triggered a fatal hemorrhage in a man whose health was already compromised. The death of Attila sent shockwaves throughout Europe. To his enemies, it seemed like divine intervention, the sudden removal of a threat that had dominated their nightmares for decades. To his subjects and allies, it was a catastrophe that threatened to unravel everything he had built. The great empire that had stretched from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea was now leaderless, its future uncertain. Attila left behind numerous sons, but none possessed his unique combination of military genius, political cunning, and personal charisma. The three most prominent were Elac, Dengizich, and Ernak, each of whom claimed a portion of their father's empire. But instead of maintaining the unity that had made the Huns so formidable, they immediately began quarreling among themselves, treating the empire, as Jordanes recorded, like a family estate to be divided and subdivided. The subject peoples who had served Attila out of fear and respect saw opportunity in the chaos that followed his death. The Gepids, led by King Ardaric, who had been one of Attila's most trusted advisors, were the first to rebel. Their uprising sparked a general revolt among the Germanic tribes, each seeking to reclaim the independence they had lost to Hunnic rule. The end came swiftly and decisively at the Battle of Nedao in 454 CE, just 1 year after Attila's death. The coalition of rebellious tribes, led by Ardaric's Gepids, faced the divided Hunnic forces under Elac's leadership. The battle was a slaughter. Elac himself was killed, along with thousands of Hunnic warriors, effectively ending unified Hunnic power in Central Europe forever. The collapse was so complete that within a generation, the Huns had virtually disappeared from European history. Some remnants fled eastward toward the steppes of their ancestors. Others were absorbed into the populations of the peoples they had once ruled. The great confederation that had terrorized 2 empires and reshaped the political landscape of Europe dissolved as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind only memories, legends, and the enduring question of what might have been. Attila's legacy, however, proved more durable than his empire. In death, he became larger than life, a figure of legend whose reputation transcended the historical facts of his career. To medieval chroniclers, he was the Scourge of God, an instrument of divine wrath sent to punish a sinful world. To Germanic peoples, he became Etzel of the Nibelungenlied, a complex figure who embodied both the terror and the strange honor of the heroic age. The impact of his campaigns extended far beyond the immediate destruction they caused. By weakening both Roman empires through constant warfare and tribute demands, Attila accelerated the transformation of Europe from the classical world of antiquity to the medieval world of kingdoms and tribes. His invasions pushed Germanic peoples deeper into Roman territory, hastening the very migrations that would ultimately replace Roman rule with the barbarian kingdoms that became medieval Europe. Perhaps most significantly, Attila represented the last great challenge to Roman civilization from the steppes of Asia. After his death and the collapse of his empire, no nomadic confederation would again threaten Europe on such a scale until the arrival of the Mongols 8 centuries later. He was the end of an era, the final embodiment of the nomadic warrior king who could unite disparate tribes into a force capable of challenging the greatest empires of the settled world. The man who had seemed destined to rule all of Europe died in his bed, not from an enemy's sword, but from his own excess. It was a fitting end for a figure whose entire career had been marked by extremes: extreme ambition, extreme success, extreme brutality, and ultimately, extreme hubris. And so, the great conqueror who once held 2 empires hostage met his end not on a glorious battlefield, but choking on his own blood during a wedding feast. Attila's death marked the swift collapse of an empire built on fear and tribute, as his fractured sons watched their father's legacy crumble within mere months. The man who called himself the Scourge of God had ultimately fallen victim to the very human frailties he sought to transcend through conquest. In the end, Attila's greatest victory may have been his transformation from mortal warlord into eternal legend, forever remembered as both destroyer and catalyst of a changing world.